Welcome to the Reality Lab Lecture Plus VR Capstone Lecture. Today, I'm super excited to introduce Yaser Sheikh. So Yaser is a super famous computer vision graphics researcher and professor. If you think about like you need to take a video, recognize body poses and videos of people, and then you're like, oh yeah, Yaser must have, like, his students must have code for that. Just like really state-of-the-art work. So currently Yaser is a director at Facebook Reality Labs, leading a big team focusing on photorealistic humans and how to create digital versions of people that look exactly like in real life. So yeah, excited to hear what you thought.
Well, thank you, Ira, and thank you all for coming out to the talk today. So Photorealistic Telepresence. This is work that I've done with an extraordinary group of people at FRL. The work itself is something we've been doing for the last 3 years, and I'm really excited to talk to you all about it. So humans are social animals, right? It's perhaps the thing that most uniquely separates us from any other species on Earth is the amount and complexity of information that we can share with other people. And this information is something that we share not just by what we say, but how we express it in terms of our facial expressions, our body gestures, and our hand movements as well. So this sort of exchange is something which we are extremely adept at not just doing, but also perceiving. Our visual systems, our auditory systems, our cognitive systems have co-evolved to become very sensitive to receiving and interpreting this information. As we've sort of spread over the Earth, we've also figured out ways of transmitting this information across distances as well. In ancient Persia, 500 BC, they started the first postal service. And this got one sort of drop of that social information that you wanted to convey through writing. Almost 2,000 years after that, or more than 2,000 years after that, once we understand how the electromagnetic spectrum works, we started telegraph, which changed this transmission of information from sort of asynchronous over a long period of time to instantaneous, but it was still the message contained inside the letter that we had written before. The invention of the telephone gave us the first approach to actually convey those signals, some of those social signals, how you sounded, where you paused. All of that emotional information that's contained in how you transmit the message was transmitted in the first time in the 1880s. And of course, the next big jump was in the 1950s. Of course, there were no iPhones in the 1950s, but what I'm showing you is the technology was first demonstrated at that time. And it's the first time you could actually see another person and interact with them. But nonetheless, it still was missing something really important, right? Why is it that when we have video conferencing systems like this, we still choose to travel out to other cities, as beautiful as they are, meet with people in person, travel back home to meet family? It's because there are several aspects that are missing in these FaceTime, Skype-like applications. The most important one of the most important ones, is eye contact. When you're talking to somebody, you want to meet their eyes, you want to sort of them to see you, you want to see them, and that basic element of social interaction is missing from VC systems like this one. Not to say the rest of the signals that you try to convey with your body. When you try to have meetings like this one, where there are more than one person that you're speaking with, these kind of solutions just don't scale well, right? What happens is that the views start to tile, and you don't get that feeling like you are with that other person or that group of people. So in my view, when people think of AR and VR, they mainly think about games. They think of games as being the primary driving application. But for me, the true promise of AR and VR is, in fact, this: meeting other people, defying distance to actually be with them. That's, to me, the true promise of AR and VR. So in our lab in Pittsburgh, the mission that we're after is experiencing authentic social interactions in artificial reality, in augmented and virtual reality. And in this mission statement, I think, is the key sort of conceptual challenge in trying to achieve telepresence in VR and AR. If you notice the two sort of operative words in this, authentic and artificial, these are opposites of each other. These are antonyms. Authenticity is opposed to artificiality. But we want to try to get to defeat this highly tuned human perceptual system and try to make you feel like there's something artificial there is not artificial. It's in fact your loved one, your friend, your colleague, and so forth. So this sort of space, sometimes called social VR, has been explored, and there are a number of apps out there that you'd see today. Facebook Spaces is one, AllSpace VR, VTime, VR Chat. There are a number of these, but they have one thing in common. All of them have stylized cartoon versions of yourself. Most of them don't attempt to represent you as you are. The thesis driving our research is this, that photorealistic telepresence is sufficient for social presence, which means that we don't know whether cartoon versions of yourself will be compelling enough for billions of people to want to use VR, but we do know that we do like reality. We do like socializing in reality. Well, most of us do, at least, right? And so this is sort of what drives us. My suspicion is that the stronger version of the statement is actually also true, that photorealistic telepresence is necessary for social presence, which is a stronger statement, and I think that is also true. And I'll talk a bit about that towards the end of the talk. One request I have is that I prefer these presentations to be interactive. So if you have clarification questions or even discussion questions in the middle of the talk, please do stop me, and we can pause and have that discussion as we go on. So perhaps a good place to start is, what is the state of the art in photorealistic telepresence? So in 2017, there was a video that was shown at SIGGRAPH. It's called the Meet Mike demo. So let's take a look.
Hi, I'm Mike. Well, kind of virtual Mike, really. This is our Digital Human project, which is a collaboration of a whole lot of companies: Epic Games, 3Lateral, Cubic Motion, Tensun, the Wiki Human team, Sydney Uni, FX Guide, a whole bunch of people coming together to produce, well, a virtual human. And not only a virtual human, but one rendered in real time, puppeteered or driven in real time, rendered in real time, and not only that, but at 90 frames a second in stereo in VR.
So this is truly, it was an astounding piece of both research and engineering, right? To be able to get that level of quality in real time, as he had said. It required more or less the MVPs in the industry and academia, right? USC, it required Disney Research, it required Epic Games, Pixar, Cubic Motion. It was essentially a collection of the talent that you'd want from the gaming and VFX industry to actually show that demo as it was. And the rig that sort of underlied it, this is sort of the standard result of 20 years of research in the VFX and gaming industry. It was an expert design rig where the motion of the rig was controlled by what are called blend shapes and joints. So blend shapes are essentially, for those who are more mathematically inclined, a PCA basis of movement, right? So it is, you linearly combine movement, and each sort of control that you do on a blend shape, it produces some movement, the linear combination of which produces the motion of the rig itself. In addition to the geometry and movement, which required 750 of these artist-created blend shapes, you had to create these reflectance maps that you combine together to produce a function that takes in all the lighting of a scene and produces what the output light's going to be. This required a team of artists to work for several weeks to produce one of these rigs. So this was back in 2017. In 2018, Epic Games showed a really astoundingly real-looking avatar that was driven through motion capture technology. And then late last year, Magic Leap showed Mika. As you can see, the animation there too. So this is the state of the art right now in virtual humans. And I wanted to set this up so you yourself can see in comparison where we are right now. Right. So this is a recent result that we produced.
There's this big ugly sucker at the door, and he said, "Who do you think you are, Lena Horne?" And I said, "No, but that I knew Miss Horne. like a sister. And she told me next time I was in town to come and look her up. Well, next thing you know, it was Lena this and Arnold that, and oh, have you met the Duke? He's right over there. And that club was jumping and jiving. Ooh, that sounds good.
So this wasn't a video, this was a rendering from a code, which I'll talk about in a second. So these are what we call codec avatars, right? And we first introduced them, built them in 2017. We published a paper at SIGGRAPH in 2018 on the work. And that's the avatar that you just saw, right? A couple of things I'd like you to notice when the mesh arrives is the eyes and the mouth in there, okay? So there's very coarse geometry there. In fact, there was no geometry there. But when you see this in VR, you actually feel like there is a full mouth and eye and everything in there too. And I'll explain a little bit about how we get there, right? So to look at this properly, it's important to think about these interactions as a communication system. Think of the person who is trying to say something to someone else as a transmitter of information, and the person receiving it as a receiver. And we have a protocol in which we exchange this. And the core thing that sort of underlies this interaction is that these signals in our representation are expressed as a time-varying code. And so what is this code, right? So on one side, you have a transmitter and receiver. They're separated by some distance. And we need to build sensors, first of all, to be able to measure what the person who's trying to convey something is doing, right? How is their face moving? How are their hands moving? How are their bodies moving? So we have to design that. Then we have to encode this in some sort of compact way, because this has to be transmitted over the network. And then on the far side, it has to be decoded. And here's something which is maybe not completely intuitive. It needs to be displayed. But this decoding is actually dependent on the transmitter as well. This is somewhat unusual in terms of codecs, that the decoder actually depends on the state of the receiver. And I hope as the talk progresses, that'll become clearer. And then finally, we need to include an environment. So where you are might change how you're rendered. So if we meet, for instance, in this room or in Ira's office, the lighting's different, we'd want to account for that too. So here's what the sort of end result, what we're aiming for, like a snapshot of what that would look like. There are two people over here. Both of them are wearing headsets. And what you see are what they see. So Shui over there sees Jason's avatar. Jason sees Shui's avatar. So this was one of our first results. And I'll show you, you can see what that looks like.
The hidden code itself, and
Yes.
it's not getting any features from the generated texture.
From the generator what?
The texture that's generated at the end.
Well, I mean, they both come from the same source.
I see.
They have the same latent variable that informs how they should generate these two components, but they don't share any components, at least in the V0 architecture. That.
So one aspect of this video which I find interesting, this was, by the way, done fully live inside VR as well, two-way, is in the middle of it, he says something, and then Jason sort of steps in and says the separated what? As if, you know, leaning in is going to make you hear things any better. But you know, the feeling is he doesn't do that just to hear better. He does it because he's trying to transmit a social signal that the other person will understand and repeat what they said, right? And I think this aspect of communication is extremely important, right? And it was good to see that actually happened here. So what is a codec avatar? A codec avatar is actually a pair of functions, FC and FD, an encoder and a decoder. And what we'll do is we'll walk through both of these to get a sense of what this creature is. So let's start with the decoder, something that takes a code. The code describes your state at a particular time instant, right? And it produces as an output something that a person inside VR or AR can actually see. So as a function, it takes in the transmitter's code, so the state of the transmitter, and the receiver's code as well. And what does it produce as an output? The left view and the right view that the person sees. Now, can anyone think of why you would need the receiver's code? To decode what someone is doing remotely, what does it matter where I am or what I'm doing? Yes?
Maybe your viewpoint?
Yes. So the viewpoint's important not just because obviously, if it was just the geometry of it, wouldn't matter that much, right? Because you can just decode the geometry and then on my side render it. It's actually the photometry that matters. Where I look at you from changes what your texture is going to be because of the way light interacts with your face. And I'll talk about that in a second. Of course, the full version of this function looks a little bit more complicated. Not only is there a transmitter's code and the receiver's code, what we can also tweak is an environment. There's no reason why we would meet in Ira's office here or my office in Pittsburgh. We could both meet at the top of the Eiffel Tower. Or we could meet in a football field. We could meet wherever we wanted to. We can change the environment as well. And then the second part of this, which is not in the simplified function, is audio. So you want to sound like you're in the middle of the cathedral, or on stage, or in a classroom. It has to sound consistent with where you are. So that's another part of this as well. But that's sort of the full form of the function. We'll just be thinking about it as in terms of the simplified one. So to produce the result I showed you, we essentially have a code which is 128 floating point numbers. And there is a network that regresses the mesh. So each of these positions is an XYZ location. And there are, I believe, about 7,000 of those. And that produces just a regression from the code directly to these mesh vertices. So it's obviously, we use a neural network for that because that's our best function approximator these days. The second aspect of it, is that appearance depends on expression as well. So if you notice, this is a person in neutral expression. I'm not sure if the projector can show this, but if you look closely, as he makes his expression, the blood flows into his forehead region, and that actually changes the appearance of the individual. And so this code not just produces the mesh, the geometry, but it also produces the texture, right? So if you think about it, this is essentially a map of the face. You've unwrapped the texture into a 2D surface, and that's what you see over there. And as the code varies, the geometry changes, but the texture changes as well. You see that there. So this code is essentially a shared encoding of both the appearance as well as the texture. And then we run this through a rasterizer to produce the image. And the goal of our optimization system, which I'll describe shortly, is to minimize the pixel difference between what you see in the image and what the model thinks it renders. And this sort of forcing it to match pixels exactly is what gives it the realism that it has. Yes, question?
And is it network trained on multiple persons, or is that specific to this person?
So this current one is trained on a specific person who had to sit in a large capture facility for almost 4 hours. And this is a really interesting and important question, is how do we go from that to billions of people using this, right? It's a really good question, which we'll get to in a second. Yeah. Yes?
So the mesh also includes all sorts of hidden stuff, right? Like the teeth and the tongue and no?
It doesn't.
In
So
this case.
yeah, so in this case, actually, what we've used is, in fact, a very simple mesh model that essentially puts like triangles that cover the mouth. And where you get the impression of 3D, which is just about to come up, is purely in the appearance. So it, in fact, sees where you're looking at the mouth from and renders your left and right eye differently for each one. And so it gives you the impression of 3D in there, even though the geometry doesn't have it. And this is one of the powerful things about this model, is that the texture can correct deficiencies in geometry and in motion estimation. And that gives it that full realistic effect. Stuff that's errors, this has a means of circumventing that error. So this is sort of key, that we don't try to minimize some perceptual error or an artist-defined error, but we try to come up with an objective measure of what's right and wrong and try to directly minimize that.
Is it with the teeth and the mouth, is it, if you choose to look at the person more from the side, then I guess it will become apparent?
Absolutely, absolutely. So it starts to break down the further you go. So in terms of our work, what we're doing is we're pushing towards trying to get as much of the geometry to be right, as much of the modeling to be right, but then give it the capacity to correct for those errors if it doesn't have it to the best that it can. Right. So here's the final piece, right? The question of why is the, sorry, is there a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Is everything trained end to end?
It is, and I will come back in just a second. But yes, it's trained end to end.
Did I understand correctly that each eye is being generated a different texture?
Yes. And this is essentially where we get.
But they share the same mesh?
The same code. The code's the same, and it's decoded separately for the left and the right.
So two separate meshes, two separate textures.
The mesh is the same, the texture is the only thing that changes. Yep.
Do you just want to, so for example, for the loss, do you just enforce the pixels to be the same, or you also have like one to smash and to say like geometry?
That's a really good question. We've tried, in fact, both. Currently, the version both of them are similar. What we do is we minimize pixel errors in the texture, right? So we back project onto the texture and we minimize errors there. And we have an end-to-end version which is complete, which goes directly to the pixels as well. And in fact, the one which is end-to-end is superior in some cases, particularly with the body where there are occlusions. So there's actually benefit in doing this end-to-end completely to the pixels.
You're training on capture data. Are you able to change the lighting?
So I'll come to that in a second. So we have preliminary results on that. Right? Yes.
Do the codes contain any explicit relative orientation information, or is it just neural network embedding?
Right. So there is viewpoint information, which is just what this part is. So to answer your question right here, right? So the appearance actually depends on the viewpoint of the person. So basically, where I look at, because of the BRDF, depending on where I look at something, changes how it looks, right? So if you look at the same person captured at exactly the same point and focus on the person's nose, right? So you see when you look at this place, there are two lobes on the person's nose. As you get more oblique, that suddenly collapses down to one. And it's something which all of us know, right? When we look at a shiny surface, where you look at the shiny surface changes where you see the bright points from. And so that's why the receiver's code is important. That's one of the reasons why the receiver's code is important. It's not the only one, but it's one of the reasons why. And so what we do is we actually make the decoding conditioned. So it's conditioned on where the viewer is looking at something from. And to your question, I think someone over there asked me, does the view code affect the geometry? It does not. Right? So where I look at something from does not change the geometry of the person, but it does change the texture. And so if you look at this, and that decodes into the image, and the view code now is produced, conditioned on the viewpoint for texture, but not for geometry. So let's take a look at this. You have the same geometry, but depending on where you're looking at it from, the texture that's decoded is different, right? All this death and decay that you see here, that's never seen when you render it. That's why the neural networks are famously lazy creatures. They don't bother producing anything meaningful over there, right?
I guess why not producing the best possible texture map? Why to depend on the viewing position to save, to compress, to save? No,
because so for instance, if I were to take a picture of you from here and take a picture of you from there, there's not a consistent texture between those two. The texture is different because it depends on where you look at someone from.
I mean, if I could get lighting, if I could figure out lighting, right? Environment, like really good lighting, and then I could figure out the albedo and like all the maps that relate to the face, then I could do it, right?
No. So that's I think one of the statements over here which is a bit strong. I said no, maybe this is a controversial statement, but the concept of an albedo itself is an approximate model. And what people have been trying to do in the graphics industry is try to incrementally model how light interacts with an object to produce the light. And it's been a sort of diminishing returns battle. There's a lot that we still don't know how light interacts well with, or at least we can't reproduce those pixels perfectly. What this does is, in a sense, something similar. It's sort of modeling the incoming light and saying how does that transfer to produce the extant light. But rather than having sort of an explicit model of it, we're throwing our best function approximator at it and saying let the network figure out how to produce those effects as much as possible. Right? So objects are not Lambertian. They're not a sum of simplification called specularities and albedos, subscattering effects. These are all components of something, but there's always an X factor that we're not able to get. And each of these mappings are in fact handcrafted as well. Right? Lambertian model is a handcrafted linear model. A Phong model is just a function approximation as well. The statement over here is, if we're going to do function approximation, let's throw our best function approximator at it and see if we can learn through. Yeah. Yes?
Related to that, I'm sure you thought about that, but rather than either or, you could imagine you're using some more traditional model, right, as your baseline model, and then learn a residual, and that could save a lot of data, and you don't have to capture 4 hours or something.
Right. So we did, and I think the main sort of question, the thought is, like the benefit of having an explicit model is generalization, right? So because it'll allow you to generalize to places where you don't have enough data. The thing is, the approach that we're trying to take is, how about we try to capture all the data, and then let the network sort of figure out what is the minimal model that you actually need, right? I feel like that's certainly an approach that we've also thought about and tried. But let's start from basics. Like, let's just collect the data and fit the best model that we have. And if that doesn't suffice, then perhaps we can fall back on more traditional methods there. So this is kind of, as you see it, what I'll show over here is that we tweak the code, right? So we're going to change the viewpoint. What you'll see is that the image will sort of fly around, and the texture will change as you change the viewpoint, and that'll change the image, but the geometry remains the same. One major sort of flaw in what I just said, in this entire sort of story I've spun for you, is the question that Dietrich asked, somebody else asked as well about lighting, Brian, you asked about relighting, is that sure, you can, if you want to capture all of the data, what does that actually mean, right? One half of that question is capturing the images. So we built this system. It's called Mugsy. This is actually a somewhat older version, but this had 90 cameras, each capturing 11 megapixels at 90 frames per second. So this part at the center of the dome is likely the most highly dense volume in the world. That'll be my guess. And what does this capture? So you see that's the forehead of a person, but you can actually resolve individual hairs because you never know where that social signal might be hiding, right? And with this, we can sort of reconstruct. Because we have sort of this many views, we can in fact do multi-view stereo frame by frame. So there's no temporal smoothing, there's no tracking. This is individual frame by frame reconstruction. And once we do reconstruction, we can also track at really high resolution, right? So what you're seeing over here is a zoomed in on the side of a person's cheek. And we can sort of track this quite finely. This was also work published last year. And so based on this reconstruction and this tracking, we built a pipeline to start to learn some of these models, right? So the process it goes into is you have this input images, you can reconstruct the person's face, detect key points to wrap a mesh around it, do the high resolution tracking that I showed earlier, build some personalized key points to get it a bit more dense, learn a regional PCA model to help track faster, and then finally we learn the codec avatar on the results of that. And what I'll show next is a bunch of these avatars that we built, right? So these are a bunch of them. You see this white line that separates real from rendered. And we're going to sweep through. And after some time, the white line is going to disappear, but it's still sweeping. So if you can see the line, that means we have, or the more you can see the line, the less good a job we've done. So we're still sweeping. This is a good place to look at here. It's sweeping.
Are they trained to make those expressions?
Yeah. So this is part of the capture sequence. Yeah. It's part of our interview process too.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So this is one half of the story, right? That's the decoder, and that sort of touches upon many questions that the vision and graphics community have been looking at for a long time. But there's a second part of this problem, which is the encoder, which is far less explored in both communities. So let's look at that a little bit, right? So what is the encoder? The encoder takes as input sensor data of the person themselves, right? The person who's actually doing the behavior, the movements, and produces as output that code that then goes to the decoder and then gets decoded. And so the input looks like some inside-out cameras that are looking at the face and the body. So these are cameras looking at the face. These are cameras looking down at the body. We had talked about this, right? And then some audio, some microphone data perhaps, maybe some other sensors in the future. But how do we go from some sensors that are trying to observe what the body is doing and go into encoding, figuring out what the person is actually doing themselves? So this is, as I'd shown, like a sequence of two people interacting.
What kind of yoga do you do?
I do hot yoga. I love hot
knew it.
yoga.
Oh my gosh. I've tried it a few times. Hot yoga, I just want to, oh my gosh. I sweat so much. I melt in there.
I love it.
So, the famous hot yoga sequence, yes. So this problem is challenging, and most of the demos that people have shown, in fact, all of them, to my knowledge, in fact, require a nice clean view at least on one side. So the Meet Mike demo that you had seen, it's a one-sided experience. One side can view it in VR, but the other person, the performer, you have to have a nice clean view of their whole face so you can observe what's actually happening. It's similar with the Siren demo in 2017, and I don't believe the Magic Leap one was driven at all. But this problem of getting to see a nice clean view of the whole face, that's not something we have in VR at all. And because you'll likely be wearing AR glasses, to an extent, not in AR either. So what we did is we built what we call an HMC, a head-mounted capture system. And in this, there are these 4 cameras embedded, one looking at each eye, one looking at the forehead, and one looking at the mouth. For the sake of this discussion, we'll just be using 3 of those, which are shown in the far left. And what you see is immediately you see the challenge. These are very unusual viewpoints of seeing the face, and they're a patchwork of the face. You're not seeing the whole face. So the system has to, in a sense, imagine what the rest of the face is doing from those few broken viewpoints that it sees. But that actually is not the real challenge here. Or, well, it's not the major challenge here. The major challenge here is the domain gap. Input-output pairs don't exist for this encoder. Now, machine learning methods work really, really well if you have a large bucket of inputs, and you can tell them for this input, you have that specific output. For this input, you have that specific output. You have to have input-output pairs, a whole bunch of them. Then you can train machine learning methods, and they'll do great. What doesn't work as well is if you have a bag of inputs, this is what can happen as input. That is what can happen as output. But I won't give you what matches with what, which is the case over here. Because when you have the headset on you, you have no way of estimating what the state of the face is that correspond to the camera views that you see. Right? So is the problem clear? Right? So how do we define a metric here? For this bag of codes that we have, which can be produced in Mugsy, our capture system, and for the bunch of HMC video that we can capture, how do we establish correspondence? And so our current best answer, this is still ongoing work, and I think a really important area of research, is to use style transfer. So let's take these images from the HMC, which are IR cameras. They're from strange viewpoints, which are incomplete, and change them so that they are of the style that we can produce from our codec avatars. Right? So we take those views, and we transfer them. It's not very clear, but we transfer them into the style that we would see from these codec avatars. And then using codec avatars, the decoder, we can in fact decode for a particular code the viewpoints near the eyes, render them into something that would look like it should from those cameras. Then we adjust this code and minimize this difference between the two. And that looks like this. What you're seeing here is a pixel-wise difference between these images and these images. And if we can find the right code, the thought is that minimizes this difference. The thought is that you would have found the right state of the person underneath the headset. Yes? All right. So let's see what that looks like. I'll play this a few times. So what you're seeing up there is the initial point of the optimization, and you will see live gradient descent. This is a rare opportunity to see gradient descent visually, right? So we're going to run a gradient descent algorithm that will try to change the expression there to minimize the difference between these two, and that's the loss function. So the first thing is observe here. Her eyes are closed, her mouth is closed, and the model that's starting over there, eyes open, mouth open. Right, you saw? Let's play that one more time. So first of all, have a look at this. You'll see she'll close her eyes and mouth, and it renders it, produces images from that viewpoint. eyes and mouth closed. One last time. Now the loss function, as it minimizes it, you see the loss reduces. Let's look at this for a few more expressions. So this will loop through a few expressions. See what she's doing there. Mouth open in a big smile. And the initialization is the same as you see before. You'll see as it goes, at the end her mouth is open. New expression. That's partially, it's okay, not great. This one's pretty good. Sort of a kissing expression. And so that is gradient descent in action. Right. Yes?
So how did you get the training data for training that style transfer network?
This one and that one. So style transfer is something which is actually an unsupervised, it's one of the few unsupervised things that actually works. You can give it, it uses GANs. So you give it two sets of initial and target, and it learns to transform from one domain to the other. That's what this thing works with. Yes?
I'm just thinking, could you build some kind of headset that like still records in the same place but doesn't obscure the whole face?
Yeah, we've had a lot of discussions, like a thin wireframe one.
Yeah.
So part of the challenge is that lighting is very critical over here. So there's in fact IR lighting inside as well. So if you do that, then the images there would change. We've thought about X-rays could help us somewhere here. You know, it's if anyone has ideas, I think this is a good place to. Yes, Kyle.
You have to worry about the cameras being in the exact same spot. If the headset slips on your face, does that change the way you have to render?
Right. So what I've not included here, obviously this is a simplified description, is in fact there is a explicit estimation of slop as well. So that's actually explicitly computed over here. Not very well though. So it is likely one of the reasons why, as you'll see, the results still leave something to be desired. And I think that it's certainly one of the reasons. So let's try to put these pieces together and see what that looks like. So you start with the transmitter, who does some behavior, and it's encoded, captured by our sensors, the head-mounted capture system, and it's encoded into this code using this network that we've built. Then that code is decoded into geometry and into texture. That's the decoder. And then finally, as a stereo pair that gets rendered for the left and right eye for the receiver. And so this is kind of like the end-to-end pipeline that you see here, right? Person's making some expressions, it gets decoded, depending on where the viewer is observing it from, it gets rendered into the view. And this thing runs live, so...
Hey Kevin, wake up!
Are we back in Pittsburgh yet?
No, we're still in Redmond. This is not Friday yet. You got to be sitting here for 2 more days.
Oh my God. Well, at least I hope people come to our demo on Friday.
So clearly we need better acting, but you know. This is what I just described as work that's forthcoming in this year's SIGGRAPH. You know, actually showing how do we do the style transfer. All the details are actually in the paper too. So that's kind of the network that we have, right? So we have this, the generation of the code in between. That's the thing that gets transmitted. And for me, you know, one of the things that's elegant in research is if that you produce something for one reason, but it turns out to be useful for a completely separate, orthogonal, and unplanned reason. That's usually a good sign that you're doing the right thing. And in this case, producing the code was necessary, compressing it is necessary for learning algorithms to actually learn something meaningful. But at the end of it, we get this code that's compressed, and you're just selling kilobytes over the network. It's very, very well tuned for network transmission already, right? So now you've compressed all of what a person's face is doing, at least, into 128 numbers. And so this is a result that we showed, that the famous hot yoga sequence that we showed earlier. One more time. So obviously that's Ben, that's Nadia, and you can see Ben starts things off here.
What kind of yoga do you do?
I do hot yoga. I love hot
knew it.
yoga.
Oh my gosh. I've tried it a few times. Hot yoga, I just want to, oh my gosh. I sweat so much. I melt in there.
I love it.
But like the session ends and like I just need like a gallon of water. I just walk right out of the room and yeah.
Exactly.
Here's another one.
So I was telling you that I believe in ghosts, and you don't because you believe in science.
Yeah.
So I think I watched too many ghost stories. I used to come home from school and watch Are You Afraid of the Dark every day. Did you ever watch that show?
Yeah, I watched it a couple times. I think I read some of the books too.
They had books?
Wasn't it? No,
Is that
I'm thinking of
Goosebumps?
Goosebumps.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Goosebumps.
Did you watch that movie? They made the Goosebumps movie with what's his name a couple years ago. That was weird.
I didn't see it.
Yeah, but I would come home and watch it by myself. I would turn on, like, it would be my treat before homework, and I would watch Are You Afraid of the Dark? And those shows creeped me out. And then I would hear things all over the house. Like, I remember sitting down at our kitchen table, and all of a sudden I heard, you know how houses...
All right, so, yes, so good.
So, this is so cool. But, so, did you experiment with the eye contact? So, did you measure in some...
We have not measured it because it is completely off. Like, it's not even close, right? Like, when you and I are talking, I would have to look like right around here before you start to feel like it. And in fact, eye contact is a very, very interesting beast, right? It's not just about maintaining, looking at a particular thing. Your eye has to feel alive. You have to be converged at the right location. So this is actually one of the two things which I think are limiting over here. You may have noticed everyone's looking a little bit down, right? And that's one part of it. The second aspect of it is you must have noticed the emotion was damped in there, right? You didn't feel like that full emotion was snapping out. These, I think, are the two major limitations, and they are directly related to this challenge of correspondence. That's a key kind of like open problem that we have to figure out how to address. So, yes?
Does some of that come from the compression of the cheeks from the goggles?
Oh, absolutely. So that's another great one, right? So as soon as you smile, it sort of lifts this up. So that makes it a challenge, but it actually has a converse problematic effect too. That as a person using it, every time I smile, I feel resistance, so I stop smiling, which is kind of a big problem with interaction. So I think this is one of those things which more and more we see in VR, is that problems are interconnected with many different things. For instance, in this particular case, telepresence is related to a mechanical problem. How is the headset mounted on your head? So the PSVR headset, for instance, has a mount here where the headset sort of floats above. There's no real contact. Much easier to make facial expressions there. So for telepresence, at least, that should be the direction we should be thinking about headsets for example, right? But it's absolutely an issue. Yes?
Where do you do the computation? I mean, running the network?
Right. So that's an excellent question. Right now, it's on a machine, and it has two GPUs, two high-end GPUs to run. Okay. I like to actually, in fact, contrast that with the Meet Mike demo, for instance. That used 9 workstations to render all of it. But nonetheless, that's not an excuse. They used 9, we used 2 high-end GPUs. Who has two high-end GPUs at home? One of the efforts we're making right now is to see if we can actually run this on board compute. And we have some early results which are actually quite promising. So in other words, just on mobile compute on the headset itself, can we do some part of the computation? And the answer seems to be yes. We haven't really explored the space much, but this is a place where the machine learning community, consumer electronics, they're all sort of pushing towards this direction of trying to speed up network evaluation, right? So I feel like the forces are on our side there. There's a lot of good work to be done there, but it's kind of in the positive direction. Yes?
Have you tried having different people drive a model of another person?
So this is an extremely interesting question because for me, when I started the talk, I said authentic interactions in artificial reality. And I think authenticity is really, really key here. For instance, when you call your mother and you hear her voice or she hears your voice, she has no doubt that what she hears is what you said. And that is one of the reasons why we use phones. Even though, when you speak into the phone, your voice is digitized, packetized, compressed, sent over the network and reconstructed, that trust exists over there. And I think it is the existential threat to this work is if people don't have that trust. When they see Dieter inside VR, if there is an iota of doubt that it isn't actually him speaking, nobody's going to engage in this platform. We have to ensure that when, structurally, in the way we build this, that when you see someone there, you are absolutely certain you're talking to the person you're looking at. because technologically it's going to be highly likely we'll be able to do that. But we're trying to build this in a way that excludes that as being possible. Yes?
So you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, like kind of the goal here is to convey the social cues, and then your loss function is just based on your pixel losses or maybe across the texture. Do you have thoughts on how you can maybe make your loss more closely match the social cues part? Like for instance, maybe focus more on the eyes and the mouth instead of these parts of the cheek, or maybe something more complex than that.
Right. So that question actually presupposes that we know what those important areas are. You said the eyes and the mouth. How do you know that's the most important? I'm not asking you to answer this question. I'll say even if you ask psychologists or sociologists, they may have opinions on this, but how do you quantify what is actually important in an interaction? How important in a conversation is the fact that you're swinging your legs right now? I mean, I don't know. But maybe it is some sort of cue for me, right? In different parts of an interaction, different parts of your bodies become important. I feel the main reason why, almost religiously, we push towards minimizing that loss function is because it is truly an objective measurement. It is truly saying this is a truth and we'll match to it. Anything else we do over there, it's going to be true some places, not true some other places, and we don't know whether it's actually valid or not. There is kind of like a simple truth to try to minimize everything, because we know for sure that if we can get to the minima for that cost function, we will match reality. And that we know works. Everything else is speculation. It's sort of, it's very difficult to exclude as something as being important when it's not. I don't know of any methodology that can do that. And so what we found, not just from the perspective of research, that as you keep on minimizing that function, we know for sure we're improving the signal. With other sort of measures like figuring out is the back of the head important, how important are shoulders in social interactions, there's no real objective way of answering that. Perceptual studies are not an answer to that too, because oftentimes if you ask me what is important, I may not be aware of it. A lot of our sort of perception is subconscious as well. So it is certainly an aesthetic choice, but we've chosen pixels as the ground truth because they are truly truth. They're something which you can measure and verify. The rest of it seems to be difficult to validate at least. And so let's build this on a solid foundation. That's at least our premise. Yes?
You also mentioned the sound that you were including earlier. I mean, I guess the way the sound reflects off the environment, that's kind of important. So do you do anything about that to recreate the sound the same way?
So what I'm going to talk about right now are like future work, right? So I think there are two kind of major things we have to figure out. One is the question over there that is this personalized? Is this for a particular person? It is right now. And we have to see how do we scale this so that it's easy for anyone to use this. That's one. The second part is completeness. So audio is part of this, right? So it's not actually just the environment. There is this very interesting thing called an HRTF. It's how your body transforms the incoming waveforms to make you hear things the way you actually hear them. We use it for spatialization, and it's really important for you to get a sense that what you're hearing is actually in 3D space. So we have to figure out how to deal with audio in that sense as well. And obviously, these are floating heads in a black background. We need to fill out the rest of the body. We need to fill out an environment. The environment matters visually because it reflects on your face to produce the right pixel colors. It affects the audio because it changes how you hear reverberations. So we have to get to these two ends. And then finally, so these sort of these are two ends that we have to solve before we get to the codec universe. So let's very quickly talk about scale.
Quick question.
Yes.
What's the impact of latency?
Interesting. So there were studies in I think the mid-90s that said that you can get up to 120 milliseconds of latency, and it would not interfere with social interactions. This is, by the way, a psychological study. We tried this. It is absolutely horseshit. I mean, that's not true at all. 120. It absolutely makes the interaction feel much more torpid. I think torpor, is that the word? I don't know. It feels a lot less engaging. I feel, just purely based on experiences, we have to get to less than like 10 milliseconds for this to work, which is beyond technology right now. So latency is a critical aspect of it. One research direction which we've tried to start several times, but it's a much harder problem than we've than expected at the start, is social prediction, which is to see if we can actually predict out a little bit, behavior a little bit out, and see if that can help us overcome latency in any way. So it's definitely an interesting research problem. Once again, I feel consumer trends are on our side here. So recently there was this really interesting experiment, I think it was at Imperial, where they had a remote concert the orchestra was in Berlin, and a singer was in London, and they managed to have a listener anywhere in the world could hear a concurrent symphony. Like they could hear the whole sort of performance in tune. And the way they did that was with a sustained 6 millisecond latency, which was the first time anyone has demonstrated this. So I think over time, trends are in our favor, but latency is a critical one. It's what makes engagement seem real. All right. So we've started to capture sort of larger sets of data over here to start to see what is the true diversity of people, right? So we need to start to capture this over larger sets of people and see sort of what kinds of models actually generalize beyond individuals. So this is the first harvest of 256, which we completed a few months ago. And creating an avatar takes weeks, a single avatar. So optimizing that process is something which we're working on too. So this is each individual is captured for about an hour of data. And so it's probably one of the largest, if not the largest, in size and depth. So oftentimes people have a lot of people, but they only capture them for a few static expressions. Or they have lots of, very few people and capture them for a long period of time. So we're trying to get good in both axes. I also think we have the honor of having the world's largest creepy teeth database too. Mouth scans in there. We've set up a machine to start doing annotations too. So start to annotate this data at a level of detail, I think, which is required for this kind of work. So that's kind of the effort on the scale side. Now I'll talk a little bit about completeness.
How much, I know sometimes the way that we speak in audio is controlled by muscles in our faces, and the way, and our tone can reflect the way that our face looks. Have you tried incorporating this data at all into training? Does it help?
So it's something which has been the subject of quite a lot of research. One of the challenges in doing that is, in fact, we do have a lot of muscles, you and I, for instance, which are similar, but it's likely that you have some muscles I don't, and I have some muscles that you don't. And I can't observe that just looking at your face. So if we could somehow measure those, it would certainly be helpful. The problem is it's very hard to measure those. So it's so far been the case that methods that include muscular constraints in them either lose detail or they don't generalize even. They generalize even less than statistical models. Yeah. Yes.
Have you worked at all with people who wear glasses or have piercings or something that would potentially obstruct the camera and change the texture of their face? Right.
Absolutely. So I mean, all the examples that you saw were not wearing glasses. They actually had their hair back. It was much more contrived. One of the whole goals of the Great Human Survey is to actually try to get the full diversity of people, including glasses, nose piercings, things like people missing an eye, unusual hairstyles, those sorts of things. That there's a really long tail over there. And I think that to really address that direction properly, we have to collect a data set that's representative of the human population, right? That number is something which no one knows what it is. It could be extremely large, but that's, I think, what it'll take.
By the way, it's extremely tricky. What do you do some special?
It's coming.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So the first thing which I think strikes everyone is this sort of floaty head. What happened to the rest of the body, right? I said your body is important, your hands are important. How do we get the rest of the body? So I included the slide. It's kind of like a history of 3D domes to capture the full body, starting in '95. Takeo Kanade built one at CMU. And then in Kyoto University in '97, France 2003, Germany 2003, the UK in 2005, Paul's Light Stage 2005, but also before that, the one in Tsinghua, our Panoptic Studio at CMU, Microsoft has one, and then Michael Black's in Germany as well. So I think two sort of interesting things about this is how international dome building has become. That's, I think, one sort of noteworthy thing about this enterprise. But the second is, interestingly, every single one of those groups is still actively working on it. Meaning, there is really some research here that needs to be done. That, and of course, it's a big pain in the ass to build one of these domes. So once you build them, you damn well use them. That's the other. I like this graph. So this is the year. and that's the gigabytes per second. So how much data are you collecting, right? And so you see here's CMU, the light stage, MPI, Microsoft, and you can see like if you extrapolate, linearly is red, piecewise linearly is blue. If you do exponential, that's that, right? I might note Moore's law is dead, so it's not like we're seeing an exponential increase in camera resolution, in compute speed, in storage. None of those are true. So exponential is actually fairly, like unrealistic. And here's where our systems are actually. And I show this, of course, because I think we're very proud of the effort it's taken to build these. But also, I feel like that's what research should be. It should be, grabbing the future and bringing it 10 years closer. That's what we should be doing. So that's a socio-opticon that we've built to capture full body movement. And so here's a quick look at it. Actually, maybe I should show the. Oh, never mind. So those things that you saw sticking out. No, we were having lunch and there was some discussion of Game of Thrones, and one of the people working on this is a fan and had made a little. Maybe at the end of the talk I'll show a little bit of it. So what were those things that were sticking out? Those were actually microphones. So to your question, we've actually covered the dome as well with 400 of these Tetra mics, which is about 1,700 microphones. What we can do is we can reconstruct. So these are 4 microphones. 3 of them are differential microphones, so they give you directional differentials. And one of them is a pressure microphone. So it gives you the pressure of the sound field and directional derivatives in each direction. And using that, you can actually reconstruct the entire sound field inside the dome to an approximation. And the goal is to start answering questions like the ones you asked. How does reverberation affect this? How does the HRT affect it? Those are the kinds of questions we want to answer here. It's just starting. We've just collected the data. No results yet. Now, to the important question of hair. So for some reason, people think hair is important. Here's where we are with it. So here's a reconstruction of hair. This is another person. And this is a result I think is quite impressive, because look at the top region over there. Okay? Look at the individual hair strands. This is not something that is built to look good. This is actually, in fact, strand level accurate. And this is 2019, sorry. It's published. It'll be published this year at CVPR. And of course, you can see, even with small movements right now, it seems to work. So we actually took 2 routes to trying to address hair. There was some discussion. Brian mentioned that in research you have to simultaneously take multiple risky paths. We took 2 paths, and both of them seemed to produce some interesting results. So this was the sort of head-on, try to get hair reconstructed. And now this is the other one, which is it's called neural volumes. This is going to be presented at SIGGRAPH this year. And this can in fact handle many different types of hair as well, right? 4 different people, very different hair types, and all of them. When you view this in VR, the impact of it, it really feels much more complete than if you just have the version which just sort of gets rough geometry for the hair. So this is one kind of important area that we have to figure out. And a promise of some of the techniques we use here, to your question of accessories like glasses, other things, even clothing, this might be a good place to look at. The next one is relighting, right? So this was a question, can we relight avatars? Brian had asked this. And so we have individual light control inside the capture system too. So we can sort of capture how a person would look with changing lighting. And so these are some very preliminary results. But this is, in fact, through an approach that conditions on the light. So conditioning by changing the light. So during decoding, if you add another conditioning and you decode it, you can relight the avatar to look like they're in another location too. This is a preliminary result right now. All right. And then finally, full bodies, right? So this is inside the Sociopticon. You can see like reconstructions. I liked this example. If you look at his jeans pocket, you can in fact, you can in fact see his hidden cell phone in his pocket too. And then you texture map it. And oddly, when you see a floating head in the black background, it doesn't bother you that much. You know, your brain fills in everything else. But seeing the full body in black, that is actually kind of disturbing, because then you don't have a sense of flooring. So we found that, in fact, getting the environment right and getting the full body right, those are interlock problems. It feels a lot better when it has the background in there too. But to anyone with a, sorry, this seems to freeze up a lot. But anyone, you know, with a graphics-tuned eye will tell you that the compositing in this is something that anyone would find very disturbing. Most people would find very disturbing. Sorry, it seems like this isn't playing well, but you know, that's something which we have to figure out too. That's also sort of a related problem we have to address. Underlying this is in fact the technology we produced for the first time to track faces, bodies, and hands at full resolution.
Hi, welcome to Reactive Hello. This is our first demo of full body codec avatars, designed to capture authentic appearance and behavior for socializing in VR. My personalized model was created from a capture system consisting of 64 cameras in our lab in Pittsburgh.
So what you should find noteworthy about this, people have shown results like this with visual hulls for a while, is that this is in fact a consistent mesh that's been tracked for hands, for the face, why that's important, because it's corresponded, we can in fact create a representation for it that's drivable. We can encode it and actually drive it from data. It's amenable to tracking. So it's not just the fact that we can track it, but the fact that it's consistent across all of the views for the hands and the facial expressions in the body. Right? This is the first time something like this was shown. All right. So that's kind of the wrap of where we're going. I think a lot of the results I've shown you, I'd like to caution, are sort of early results. They are first results. There's a lot of research that's required to solve corner cases over here, make the results I've shown robust, and much of this still lives in research. This is far from ready for productization. And I would definitely say, you know, in terms of looking at research, there are many, many problems that will stay with us for a while, I think. But these are some sort of directions which we've been pursuing. So, you know, when in the popular mind, when people think of AR and VR, increasingly they think of it as yet another in a series of technologies that are sort of going to separate us from the rest of the people around us. And I think this kind of view is profoundly mistaken. You know, VR and AR, the real promise of them is to connect people in a way that we've never seen before. All of us know friends who we've left in other cities or who have left, you know, the cities we live in. And we know that proximity determines relationships. Who you live close to is who you have relationships with. We don't choose who we have relationships with. Where you live determines who you have relationships with. And I think the true promise of this technology that we're building and of AR and VR in general is to allow us to choose who we have relationships with. All right, thank you. These are some papers we have. If you have questions, please feel free to email them. Yes?
You mentioned EEG. Can you talk about anything you might be working in that area?
Say that again?
EEG as a potential sensor input?
Right. So there's been a lot of work in literature showing that EEG is good for tracking eyes. It's electrooculography. That's mainly been where we've done some experimentation. It seems promising. But that's the application we're looking at. It's attractive because it's low power, high frame rate, and it's complementary to imaging information. Yes?
Are you also looking into using these models to extrapolate the motion, things like that?
Yeah, so especially as we look into the body, right? There are parts which will be occluded. There'll be parts like, for instance, which are well constrained by the floor, but you can't observe. So for that, I think extrapolation, spatial extrapolation is definitely something which we'll be looking at. Temporal extrapolation or forecasting, I think, is extremely interesting for the latency question. Can we, in fact, project this out into the future and reduce latency. So both of those are in fact important for us. In a different sense, I think forecasting is important in the dynamical modeling sense. So right now all the results you saw were frame by frame. But obviously we should have some sort of a temporal model in there. If for nothing else but for multimodal fusion, we'll need to use dynamical models in there as well. So I think these questions are all sort of interlocked somewhere in there. Yes?
Eventually people will not be able to sit in front of these systems. I know you're collecting all this data, but what do you envision as the way that an individual will, how much will they need to do to capture their authentic essence, visual essence at least?
So the honest answer to that is I don't know. Right? So in a sense, the purpose for collecting all of this data is to answer precisely that question. What is the minimal amount of capture that we need for someone to be able to produce their avatar? And obviously the end result is not that you have to spend 4 hours inside a crazy capture facility before you get your avatar. The ultimate goal would be that you take out your cell phone, take a few pictures of yourself, the system crunches it a little bit, uses the information it has on people, priors that it has on people, fills up your model and then asks you, it's aware of its own ignorance, and it says, can you smile from that perspective? Can you sort of have a Wonder Woman power pose from this perspective? Those sort of things, those sort of requests, and then it'll build a model out of you. One, again, positive trend is that when someone's using VR or AR, the more you use it, the more it'll know about how you move, and it can progressively improve your model as well. So there are some ways of doing it, but that question is something which is one major sort of uncertainty here. How much data do we need to collect? Well, actually, the question is a more, I think, profound one. How unique are we? Right? That's the real question. And I mean, maybe perversely, so I'll say I don't think we're as unique as we think we are. Yes.
I guess your thesis mentioned like sufficient and necessary. How do you define those conditions? Do you have can you have a meeting in this medium and find that it's sufficient to get the same kind of information across? How do you kind of quantify success?
So sufficient in the sense that we have an existence proof. Reality is the existence proof of photorealism. Right? We know that people do interact successfully in when they look and move exactly how they do. So in a sense, that thesis is self-proven. It's just that we have to build it out. The part which I said necessary, I think that requires a little bit more explanation. It's again, when you ask a person, we're going to make you look exactly like you do. They're like, I don't want to look like the way I do. I want my hair back. I want to be much slimmer than I am. That's what they'll say. Or I want to be a dragon or a ninja turtle or something of the sort, right? That's what people say. We don't want to be ourselves. But the thing is, for telepresence, your identity is not your own. It is kind of like the shared agreement that you have with every person that you know of how they expect you to look and move. And so, the way you look is the only one we know of, which will work for you and everyone you know. And so that aspect of it is really important to preserve realism. That is why I feel like it will be necessary as well as sufficient for telepresence to work. Yes?
How are you building security into the model to, say, prevent people from using the model of another person? Have you been thinking about that?
We've actually had a lot of discussions around the subject, and good security is always about redundancy. Can you approach it from multiple? So there are ideas around hardware authentication. So you kind of like have two-factor authentication on the device that you're using. It's your device. It's one approach that we could approach this with. Another one is that it recognizes who you are. We're getting these views, quite good views of your mouth and face. We can. The other part of it is that we can build decoders which are tuned to you. So in the aspect of how they're built, they're encrypted. So these are some ideas. So these are some ideas that we're exploring. But I feel like we have to develop it in conjunction with the technology we're developing. We have to take this very seriously. Yeah. Yes?
Have you tried, I don't know how to describe this, but reverse the model so you can figure out of the capture data which cameras and microphones actually produce valuable data and which ones didn't?
Yeah, so we did that calculation. So this would be the kind of light field approach to this, right? As crazy as the capture system appears, it is, like thousands, many orders of magnitude smaller than what it would take to capture the full light field. And in fact, what these neural networks with machine learning methods are, they are essentially glorified interpolation devices. They're just very powerful at interpolating data. And that's what we're doing over here. We're taking sparse captures of the light field and ultimately the audio field and letting machine learning allow us to interpolate in there. That's essentially what this is to reduce that load. If we could build that device, I would build that device. But that device is many thousands of times, maybe actually millions of times more than this. I forget the actual math. But it's a much, much bigger ask to build that device. Yeah.
Actually, related to interpolation, are you able, I mean, ideally you would train it how to interpolate, extrapolate, go beyond the views, in between the views, I should say, with more precision. You know what I mean? Like the highlights can be, if you have fairly diffuse lighting, it'll be fine to interpolate.
Yep.
But if you have fairly sharp lighting, so I noticed you use a lot of diffuse lighting in these scenarios.
Yep.
But in reality, we have a lot of fine highlights and so on, and just interpolation won't do very well there unless you train the network how to move highlights, let's say.
So I'm not sure that that's true. So that aspect of it, like where a highlight appears and then from another view, if it sort of disappears and reappears, then the interpolation has failed, right? We have to make it somehow appear. I'm not sure that we won't be able to do that. I mean, this is something which we have to demonstrate, and we recently got to a point where we can individually control lights, and we've started work on this. I think the challenge, which will be much harder, is when the light comes close by and you have cast shadows on the face. Those kind of lighting scenarios, I think, are going to be much, much more challenging to get, because then it links geometry to photometry to the light positions. That, I think, is going to be challenging. So-called far-field light, like environmental lighting, I think even the specular parts, my sort of intuition tells me we'll get there. The parts which I'm much less confident of is much more complex lighting scenarios where the lights are much closer by.
Do some synthetic augmentation.
Always as the fallback. Let's try to capture real data and try to minimize to it. If we cannot, then we need to be smart. But I like dumb methods wherever we can. Yes.
Do you think your standard for authenticity is going to be the same over time, or are you going to retrain what we consider to be authentic, or how we measure authenticity, by presenting us with a new level of this?
So are you asking that does a person's authenticity individually change over time, or what we consider as society?
My perception of, as I have a phone call or a VR call with someone, what I would consider to be authentic. Do you think you can retrain that somehow, teach us that certain things are authentic that we don't consider authentic right now?
Interesting. Certainly not our goal. But I feel like that, yeah, so okay, good question. So will this impact, what we consider to be acceptable for interactions? Almost certainly, right? So this is kind of far in the future. When we have this thing figured out, people will want to do things like physics-defying hairstyles and 3D tattoos, or I don't know what they will do, right? So they will sort of evolve in some certain way. I feel like where we're standing right now, the challenge is, in fact, can we get to how people actually are? That's where we want to get to. And all of the things you're talking about, those are futures. Those are possible futures we can do. We can choose as a sort of society to say authenticity is what physical reality is and nothing more. And let's stick to that. Or possibly in the future we say we want to sort of be more fantastic in these spaces. And maybe there are special societies or communities where that's permitted, others there's not. It's an extrapolation that's certainly possible. I'm not sure if we can speak sort of in an informed way about it right now. I think that Alex was, yes.
To what extent can you exploit the use of templates, like the imperfections in human memory? So like, if you're video conferencing with somebody, it means that you haven't seen them, you're not seeing them in person. So can you kind of use a hairstyle from a template of hairstyles, or use a face shape from a template of face shapes to approximate what they look like, since they're not seeing them in person?
So almost certainly you'll be doing that anyway, right? So for instance, like in fact, in my own captures, I had a beard. I chose foolishly to shave it off a few months after that, just before we were doing a capture. But anyway, so I mean, it happens anyway. You change your hairstyle. People might put on makeup one day, might not the other day. That will happen anyway. I think our push should still be on trying to say how authentically can we represent the identity of that person. As long as that identity is preserved, I think any transforms that still preserve a shared identity of that person should be allowed. This is my view.
A person's soft tissue facies changes significantly throughout the day. the vigilance, the resting tonus of the facial musculature, circulating catecholamines and stressor molecules. Did you get any sleep last night?
Yep.
I mean, it's
Yep.
all written all over
Yep.
our faces. And how would you, or would you want to incorporate diurnal information into how the face is written?
Want to, yes. Can we, no. So we're very far from being able to do that. But I will say, you know, for instance, when I'm using this, I'll be wearing a headset that'll be looking at my face as it is. So, you know, at least the information exists that tells me how my face is looking across the day. So at least we have a hope of modifying it. Can we build models that can get that to that level of fidelity? That's a whole other challenge, right? So I feel like we are fairly far away from that level of detail. We need to get to that level of detail, but we're not close yet. Sorry, here.
Yeah, could you speak a little bit about your thoughts of, you've been focusing on VR in the talk, but I imagine myself wearing AR glasses and talking with like my mom in some
Yep.
other country, right? So could you speak about that a little
Yep.
bit?
So AR is I think, I always think of AR as the step next beyond VR, right? It has all the challenges of VR plus a whole ton of extra ones. And in AR, for instance, it'll be very important to relight a person to look like they look in this environment. So from your glasses, you have to measure what your environment lighting is, and then guess if your mother was to appear over here, how would she look like, right? So that's one. The other one is we put these cameras looking at the mouth, looking at the face. From a sort of glasses form factor, how do we place cameras over there? This is not clear at all, right? So those are certainly some problems we have to get to, but I think AR is strictly harder than VR in this sense. Yes?
So you talked a lot about the preserving the data or convincing the other person that it's you, but if you just do regular video conferencing, isn't that fairly trivial? But so I guess,
Right.
I guess the challenge is how to make it all 3D and realistic while still preserving that same identity.
Yeah, so the question of what does this provide beyond video conferencing, I think that's really the test, right? So if this doesn't provide anything to you beyond video conferencing, there's no use here. So here are some of the things which come to my mind when I think about this, right? The first one, as I mentioned, was eye contact. When you are Skyping with somebody, what happens? I'm looking down there on the floor, you're looking up there, right? It's a very awkward way of interacting. When there are 4 sites that are trying to video conference together, what happens? It tiles into these 4 boxes and it doesn't feel real. If we have a whiteboard, have you ever tried to have a video conference with someone, try to explain something on the whiteboard? You spend so much time sort of getting the camera to zoom in, then they control it. Imagine if this thing works, you put on the headset, you are both there together. You're standing at the whiteboard, you know, working on it together. You can talk to one another. You can actually, like, if many people show up, they form a circle just like they would in real life. So you're turning and using your normal cues to look at them. You're making eye contact with them, right? You see their full bodies. Like, you look at them, you see the context of their bodies, how their hands are moving, how their bodies are moving. That's the vision of it, right? And somebody mentioned this, but the sort of obvious reason that all of us know that video conferences is not a substitute for in-person interactions is why do we fly? We all fly so much. You've all seen those kind of flights all over the world. It's because video conferencing is great, you know, and it'll continue to remain a modality people will use, but there's something left out. And in this graph that I showed earlier, this one, right? The interesting thing is each of these technologies are still with us. We still message. We still talk on the phone. We still use video conferencing. I think all of these will remain. This is not going to replace everything. In fact, it'll replace none of those. It'll just be one more modality that we'll use, in my opinion, for more intimate, you know, high bandwidth communications, discussions that actually matter a lot to us. That's what this will be used for, is my guess. Yes?
Have you thought about putting an expiration date on these models? Like, am I going to be able to use my avatar from a decade ago, or?
That is an excellent question. I think it's a hard one. I don't know what the right answer to that question is. My feeling is what should be allowable is anything which preserves identity. Now, what does that mean? I don't have a precise answer to this. And I think this is a discussion as this thing becomes more and more sort of mature. We will sort of have a lot of discussions internally and externally about this to understand, you know, what really should we do about questions like this one. It'll raise that question and a ton of other ones, which I think are ethical in their nature, and we need to think about them. Yes.
All right, let's, another question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Following up on the question about giving a group presentation, let's say you have a product and an individual comes to you and says, I have the greatest product, but I am the worst salesman I have no affect for being a salesman. I like authenticity, but I want meta authenticity.
Yep.
Can you take my very vanilla flavored gestures and expressions, superpower them for the audience so I can sell my product?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent example. Another one which we've thought about as well is, there's well-documented biases against ethnic groups, against women in job interviews, right? What if we could have a version in which you go for an interview and the interviewer is unaware of what your gender or your race is, right? So definitely there's a case to be made for that too. And like in what cases is this going to be acceptable or not? Another kind of excellent question, right? It opens it up. What we're focused on over here is let's try to get that particular person correctly. And then maybe it'll sort of give us more information about what the contours of doing this right actually means. I don't know what the answer to that is. Yeah. Yes?
Last question. How do you think the scene and the human can be, how do you think the scene and the human can be captured together? Like for static scene, I can think of them as like two paths, but as you said, like when you're drawing on the board or you're manipulating objects, like the scene and human are all together and like static all together. Like what do you envision is the capture system for?
So I would love to see this as being purely head mounted. So it's not like there are capture systems all around. You have to connect to PC. You have a headset, you wear it, you're in, and that's it. That's what we want to get to. Whether it's possible to do or not, I mean, of course, is another question, but that's what we want to get to. Hopefully the cameras that are looking outside would be able to see the whiteboard as well as I'm writing something, because I like to look at what I'm writing, and it will see what I'm doing and modify the virtual background, virtual environment simultaneously.
But the human typically have like a model, like as you said, but the objects and they can be rearchitected. What's the model for combining these all together?
Right, so not necessarily, right? So we could, for instance, I think I was talking to Aditya, there's ShapeNet, which is a large repository of 3D objects. We could conceivably actually have models for most of the things we have. I mean, laptops, coffee cups, screens. For many things, we actually can have models. We can have models for environments as well. So one sort of future is that we just have models of everything. That's one possibility. The other way is if we can have something like what we were doing with hair, which is try to model it non-parametrically and still make it happen. So of course, the real answer to your question is we haven't done any of it, so we don't know. It may be an extremely difficult research problem. But I feel like as long as we have ways of observing it, we at least have a chance of solving it. So we do have ways of observing it. So I think we will figure out ways of solving it.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.